Hello students, I am Dr. Saleha Jamal, Faculty Department of Geography, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. So here we are with the course Climate Change, Vulnerability and Adaptation, and today's topic of discussion is vulnerability to climate change, which is very important to understand because when we will understand the vulnerability, then only we can reduce the negative impacts of the climate change. So starting with the class, first, we have to describe what is vulnerability. Actually, the term vulnerability is used by the different disciplines in different perspective. For example, vulnerability is used for the climate change vulnerability, disaster management, management vulnerability, vulnerability assessment regarding food security, livelihood, etc. So, a general consensus regarding the definition of the vulnerability is not much easy. So here we are dealing with the concept of vulnerability related to the climate change. Actually, it can be defined as the extent to which climate change may damage or harm a system, and that system may involve the human beings as well as the ecosystem. So simply it is the extent, or we can say the rate, the range to which the climate change may damage or harm a system, which will include the human beings as well as the ecosystems. And if we comes to its definition, it refers to the state of being exposed to harm either physically, emotionally, socially or economically. Means we can say the exposure may be physical, may be social, may be economic or may be emotional. So it can be defined as the state of being exposed to harm either physically, emotionally, socially or economically. Not only the vulnerability depends on a system sensitivity, but also on its ability to adapt to the new climatic condition. How much we are capable of adapting the new climatic conditions, the vulnerability also depends upon that also. For example, generally the poor nations we call it, which is not financially very much stable, they are they are more sensitive for adapting the changes that is mainly caused by the climate change as compared to the more stronger, more technologically advanced, more financially established nation. Similarly, if we talk about in terms of the population, the poor population who lack generally access to the resources, access to the new technologies, they will be more vulnerable, they will be more exposed to, they will be more sensitive to the climatic changes. So, it depends not only the system sensitivity but also on its ability to adapt to the new climatic conditions. For example, people who live on plains are more vulnerable to the floods than people who live in higher up. It's but obvious the people who are living in plain, they will be more susceptible to floods as compared to the poor living in higher people living in the higher reaches. So finally, we can understand that the vulnerability will be defined as the degree to which people, communities and the ecosystem are exposed to the negative consequences of climate variability and the extremes. Here we are taking all the aspects, means we are taking flora, fauna, means overall whole living organisms, and these organisms who interact with their environment, the habitat, the ecosystem is also being included. That's why when we define vulnerability, we say it is the degree to which people or any community or the ecosystem exposed to the negative consequences of the climate variability and its extreme. Or in other words, it can be said as the probability that a species, system or resource would suffer as a result of climate change, and which is mainly assessed by the different components. So the major components which are used or which are used to assess the vulnerability are exposure, sensitivity and the ability to adapt. So first, these are the major components. They are generally used to assess the vulnerability, whether for the humans, community, or for the ecosystem. So talking about the exposure, it is simply the rate at which the species or system is the degree and rate at which a species or system is impacted by climate change, for example, by variations in temperature or precipitation. The rate at which mainly the systems, or we are calling about the species who are exposed to the changes brought by the climate change, for example, in terms of the temperature or in terms of the precipitation. Sensitivity, another component is sensitivity, that is the likelihood that a species or system may be impacted by the climate change. So here we are talking about the likelihood. Vulnerability is what? That is the assessment of the sensitivity to the climate change. So likelihood, if we assess the likelihood, accordingly we can plan and accordingly we can reduce the impact of the climate change. So here sensitivity defines it is a likelihood that a species or a system may be impacted through the climate change, taking into account the traits, the characteristics and the environmental requirement of the species or the system. So here we are going to assess the likelihood about the species and the system that may be impacted by the climate change. The third one is the ability to adapt. The ability to adapt, how much species is potential, how much the species is strong or the system is strong that they can get adapted to the changing situation related to the climatic change, or they can also adapted and they can acclimatize themselves to the change situation due to the climate change, or even what are the strategies they may use to deal with the changing situation. That defines the ability to adapt. So these are the three major components which is generally used to assess the vulnerability related to the climate change. We know both the ecosystem and the people are at risk from the climate change, because climate change is what? The global change in the climate that is taking place, and whatever that is there on this planet earth will be impacted in one way or the other way, whether we call it in biotic factors or abiotic factors. Flora will be impacted, the fauna will be impacted, the habitat, the environment to which these living things interact, that will be impacted. That's why it is said not only the people but overall the ecosystem and the people are at risk of this climate change. And there are various elements which are included in this idea, some of which you can quote example here, like geographic location, socio-economic level, infrastructure and resource accessibility. These are few of the elements that can combat with the changes that is brought by the climate change. So some of the communities and regions are especially more vulnerable. For example, I have talked about the poor nations. They are frequently more vulnerable than the other developed nations. In the way how we can say that the poor nations are frequently more vulnerable than others, because due to their low potential for the adaptation. This low potential for the adaptation, if we talk about, that is very much it is related to the economic limitations. They don't have such resources or they don't have such access to the amenities and facilities with the help of which they can adapt themselves to the changing environment. So not only they have the low potential, but this low potential is directly related to the economic constraints. So reliance on the climate sensitive resources like fresh water and agriculture, many of the communities livelihood like of fishermen, farmers, they are somewhat directly related to the climate sensitive resources. So they would be impacted more. That's why it is said that the few communities like farmers, fishermen, or we can say especially the poor nations are frequently more vulnerable than the others. Among the things that make someone more vulnerable are, what are the things that make someone more vulnerable? Poverty, that is what I have talked about. Economic constraints, certainly because of poverty there will be no access to the newer technologies, more stronger technologies, stronger infrastructure facilities in the region, access to the various amenities and facilities. So certainly poverty can make more vulnerable. Then again, ineffective leadership, we are talking about. If the leadership is strong, then there will be awareness about the ill impact, the negative impacts of the climate change among the people. There will be certain plans and strategies which will be implemented time to time, seeing the changes to the environment, to the planet Earth which are going on. So if the leadership is not effective, these implementation, or there may be the possibility of failure of plans and certain strategies. So effective leadership is also needed to make the region, to make the nations more resilient to the climatic changes. During these climatic changes, we are seeing that various resources are at stake. Maybe in terms of the fresh water we are talking about, there is lots of scarcity is faced in various regions. We have seen the 0 day for the water in different regions. Also there may be the scarcity of certain renewable and non-renewable resources. So conflict may arise. Such type of conflict also makes the nations or the regions more vulnerable to the climatic changes. Not only this, unstable access to the resources such as forest, farms and water, already I have discussed. Coping mechanisms that are inefficient and unsustainable. If we are talking about this in everything, in terms of the development, in terms of the strategies, in terms of the planning, we are talking with the perspective of sustainability. Because for example, just take, previously we have thought about the development, only we were thinking about the economic development in which we have exploited our resources recklessly. But later on we started to think in terms of the sustainability, or in terms of the holistic development. Not only the economic development is needed, but we can say overall development is the need of the hour. The nation or the community or the people should be developed in holistic manner, means economic development, social development, political development, all sorts of development completes the paradigm of development. Now we are talking the development in terms of the sustainable development, because we are seeing the repercussions of reckless use of our resources. That's why we are talking about sustainable development. That is the thing here, that coping mechanism that are inefficient and unsustainable. If the mechanism, the technologies are such that those are unstable, surely those regions, those communities will be more vulnerable to the climatic changes. Not only this, certain livelihoods like fishing group, pastoralist and the small holder farmers might be particularly at risk, because the small land holding farmers, they are most dependent upon the monsoon, they are most dependent upon the rainfall. So there, if the rainfall regime changes, erratic rainfall is observed, certainly the farmers community will be affected. So these sort of existing disparities may be made or may be worsened by the climatic changes, which might raise the likelihood of food insecurity, health problems, evictions and loss of livelihoods too. Loss of livelihood, lots of changes we can say that are taking place in water bodies, and we know a good amount of community, a good amount of people are related with the water bodies for their livelihood. So if we are losing the water bodies is day by day shrinking. So certainly that will affect the livelihood of the people who are dependent on those water bodies in terms of the fishing activities, in terms of the agricultural activities, etc. Or even we can say changes in the precipitation regime, changes in the temperature regime, shifts in the months of the rainfall, that will also impact the farmer community. So these disparity with the climate change may be worsened if we are not planning properly. So ecosystem themselves may also be at risk. We are not only talking about the people, we have to also talk about the ecosystem which are at risk. For example, we know the marine ecosystem is at risk because of global temperature rise, because of we can say acidification, we can say coral bleaching is taking place. As the global temperature is rising, the temperature of water, marine water is rising, which is not very much suitable for the coral polyps to flourish. They generally expel their algae part, which thrives in their tissue and turns into white color, which is known as coral bleaching. So these are what we can say, not only the people but the ecosystem themselves are at risk, and we have to talk about that. As the habitat degradation and biodiversity loss is exacerbated due to the climate change, so we have to take into account not only the impacts on the human beings or the people, but also the impacts on our ecosystem, different ecosystems. Now the key factors that are contributing to the vulnerability of the climate change. If we talk about, there are various key factors which contributes to the vulnerability to the climate change. For example, the geographic location. Certain areas are more prone to extreme weather events, such as if we talk about the coastal region, they are more prone to certain weather events like floods. We can talk about hurricanes, tornadoes, or even we can talk about the areas like arid zone. They are more prone to the droughts. So actually the geographic location also play a very important role, and that contributes to the vulnerability due to the climate change. So you can give a good example regarding the coastal areas which are more prone to flood, tornado, hurricanes, or even we can say the arid regions, we are more prone to the drought areas. Coming to the socioeconomic status, the people having, the community or the people or the nation having the low socioeconomic status, they are more vulnerable to the changes brought by the climate change. So communities with lower income levels may lack resources for adaptation, such as infrastructure, healthcare and education. So they can lack these resources. Not only this, sometime migration is needed due to the climate change, sometime rehabilitation is needed. For that, if the socioeconomic status level is low, so they will lack these resources and surely they will be more vulnerable. Some of the social and economic impact of climate change is given in this diagram. If you see the relocation of the whole town, we know that the low lying areas or the we can say coastal areas, day by day due to the sea level rise, due to the glacial melting, these areas are drowning, these areas are being drowned under the water. So a whole town, a whole community, we can say, that is to be rehabilitated. That is another, we can say, both social and economic burden. So that is social and economic impact of the climate change. Shrinking productivity or the harvest, mainly the agriculture we can see, which is dependent upon directly on the temperatures or precipitation. If due to the climate change, the regime or we can say the erratic nature is seen, or some sort of anomaly is seen in the temperature rise or in the rainfall, certainly it will affect the productivity. Not only this, if the productivity or the yield of the crop is lowered, there will be the scarcity of the few products. So the price of basic food and stuff, that will rise. That is another impact. Not only this, there is change in our physical environment, change in the temperature. We are saying that temperature, global temperature is rising. There will be disease will spread due to the higher temperature. We know that for the insects, bacteria, the warm and humid climatic condition is more conducive for them to breed. So if the temperature is rising, we can see the spread of disease will be seen. For example, the spread of mosquitoes can be seen in more wider region nowadays as compared to few decades before. Extreme meteorological phenomena will cause widespread poverty. Not only this, fresh water will be in short supply in many of the areas, and nowadays we are seeing the example of many of the urban areas, the cities who are suffering with the fresh water supply. more wars to gain access for the limited resources. There will be war, loss of capacity to work due to heat. The best example can be quoted in the urban areas which are emerging as urban heat island. The cost of adapting coastal areas to the rising sea level. So these are few of the social and economic impact, and here we are discussing the factors which contributes vulnerability to the climate change. For example, geographic location we have talked about, socioeconomic status. Next, health status. Individuals with pre-existing health conditions, for example, if somebody is already suffering with the cardiovascular diseases, they will be more susceptible to the climate related health risk such as heat stress or vector borne diseases, etc. Access to information. We know that the negative impacts about the climate change is still it is lacking in various groups or communities. So the communities with limited access to climate related information may be less prepared for the extreme weather events. That's why nowadays you can see the awareness or the topic related to the climate change has been added also to the school level in order to increase the awareness regarding the climate change. Ecosystem resilience, the natural ecosystem that are already stressed, suppose the deforested area, the polluted area which is already stressed. We know these forests are the natural carbon sinks which absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the presence of the sunlight for the photosynthesis purpose. So they are the natural sinks, or we can say they absorb the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If that area is removed, certainly the carbon dioxide, the level of carbon dioxide will increase, and which is a major driver of climate change, greenhouse effect related to the global warming. So natural ecosystem that are already stressed, like from the deforestation, pollution, they will be less able to cope with the climate changes impacting biodiversity and ecosystem services. Political and institutional framework. If the governance is weak governance and lack of policies for disaster preparedness response can increase the vulnerability. We know that we cannot stop the disasters completely, but we can reduce its impact. We can reduce the impact of climate change for sure, for which we need disaster preparedness plan. If there is weak governance, that will lack preparedness plan. So that will become more susceptible to the disasters related to the climate change. Cultural factors, communities with strong social networks may be more resilient due to the collective action and shared resources. Infrastructure, poorly designed infrastructure in terms of the, we can say, bridge, or we can say different structures, if they are weak, poorly built, or higher technology is not utilized, certainly that will be more harmful and that will be more vulnerable to the climatic changes. So poorly designed or maintained infrastructure can exacerbate the impacts of climate change such as flooding or heat waves. Not only this, addressing these vulnerabilities, we have talked about all sort of vulnerabilities in terms of the geographic location, health, infrastructure, cultural factors, governance. If we have to address these vulnerabilities, it requires integrated approach. So we have to collaborate with each other, whether it is social, economic, environmental factors, in order to build resilience against the climate change impacts. Now, types of vulnerability to the climate change. There are several types of vulnerability. Here just we are going to discuss few of them, and in detail we are going to study in next lecture. So, among the various type of vulnerability, first we will start with the physical vulnerability. As the term physical states, here we are dealing with the natural environment, and so the exposure of the natural environment and the built up in structure to the direct impact of climate change can be termed as physical vulnerability. Means the natural environment and built up structure which are exposed to the climate change situation, that brings the physical vulnerability, such as the extremes of weather events, For example, storms, flood, droughts, or we can say the gradual changes like rising temperature and sea levels. Like the coastal areas vulnerable to the rising sea level, increased storm surges leading to the loss of land and infrastructure. So actually this type of physical environment is more prone as compared to other like coastal areas. So ecosystem like coral reefs, wetland, forest are sensitive to the changes in temperature, rainfall patterns and ocean acidification. I have already talked about the ocean acidification. Economic vulnerability, degree to which the region or community's economy is affected. I have said several community depends upon directly to the resources that is affected by the climate change. For example, agriculture community we are talking about, pastoralist community we are talking about, fisherman community we are talking about, here also it is given, if you see agriculture, fisheries, tourism, energy, industry, these are all the economy that is all directly or indirectly related to the climatic conditions. So these will be more vulnerable. As we know, the farmers are vulnerable to the changing weather patterns such as prolonged droughts or we can say erratic rainfall, which can reduce crop yields and food security. Similarly, if we talk about the climate change, it affects the marine ecosystems including rising ocean temperatures and acidification, which will affect fishermen, threatening the livelihoods of mainly the fishing communities. So this is what we can say economic vulnerability. Talking about the social vulnerability, when the different social groups are susceptible to the impacts of the climate change based on the factors like income, education, gender, age, disability, access to the resources. For example, you can understand social variability by quoting example like poor communities we know they often live to more exposed areas. Just for example, you can take this example of slum. Where do they reside? So actually the poor communities, they reside or live in the more exposed area near the flood plains, or they may have the informal settlements and have fewer resources to recover from the climatic changes or climate disasters. Not only in the social group, if we can also quote example about the women, often they have the fewer economic resources and the social power, making them more vulnerable to the impacts of the climate change. Health vulnerability. Health vulnerability actually impacts on human health that is caused by the increased frequency and intensity of climate related hazards, such like we can quote example here, changing disease vectors or even the temperature changes. Changes in the climatic condition can expand the habitats of disease carrying vectors. As for we can here give the example about the mosquitoes. Their habitat is being increased due to the rise in the global temperature. Thus, we can observe increase in the incidence of diseases like malaria, dengue, Lyme disease, etc. Not only this, rising temperature can increase the formation of ground level ozone, which leads to several respiratory issues such as asthma. Cultural vulnerability, impacts of climate change on the cultural practices, traditions and heritage of the communities. For example, rising sea levels or even the desertification can lead to destruction of culturally significant landscape, including the religious or the sacred sites. Institutional vulnerability, that is the inability of the government system. Actually, when we talk about the institutional vulnerability, it is simply defined as the inability of the governance system regarding the implementation of policies and the institution which will adequately respond or can mitigate the impacts of the climate change. For a weak institution can exacerbate vulnerability, failing to provide critical services and infrastructure for the disaster response. Lack of effective climate policies, corruption or weak institutions can also prevent communities from accessing needed resources. So regions without comprehensive adaptation strategies or investment in resilient infrastructure are generally more exposed to the climate risk. What are technological vulnerability? Nowadays, we talk about technology at priority. There was a notion that resource regions are more prosperous and more resilient. But nowadays, if the technology is advanced, that can undermine the resource region also. Best example you can see, Japan. Resource-wise, it is not very rich, while India, resource-wise, it is very rich. But the level of advancement, we can see that Japan is at the higher rung in the level of advancement as compared to India. So, technological vulnerability, it refers to the reliance on infrastructure and technologies that may not be resilient to the climate change. For example, poor design technology can increase more susceptibility to the climate impacts. For example, old or poorly maintained infrastructure such as bridge, dams, power grids is more vulnerable to extreme weather events and rising temperature and flooding. That's why it is said economies heavily depend on fossil fuels. We generally say nowadays the economies heavily depend upon the fossil fuels that is facing a major challenge, or we can say the scarcity. So, we are planning to transition this dependent to the cleaner technology, or we can say environment friendly technology. So, thus it will increase their vulnerability to both climate impacts and carbon regulations. Talking about the political vulnerability, the impacts of climate change on governance, social stability and international relations is also very much important. Unstable government, or we can say political instability, can exacerbate the effects of climate change. Climate change many times induces resource scarcity. The example of water, or we can say the arable land, this type of scarcity may lead to certain types of conflicts, political instability, or even we can say migration, that comes under the political vulnerability. Lastly, geographic or spatial vulnerability. It is when we talk about the geographic vulnerability, it is related to the physical location of the communities and the ecosystem. For example, if we talk about the physical location, we know that the coastal areas are more prone to climate related risk like rising sea levels, floods, or even the droughts or extreme weather events. Like hurricanes and tornadoes, those events affect more the coastal areas as compared to the other areas. Not only this, the sea level rise, low-lying islands, states are particularly more vulnerable to the rising sea levels, the storm surges and coastal erosion. So, these are what somewhat we can say related to the geographic or spatial vulnerability. Now, after discussing all these types of vulnerability, there is a one thing to discuss here, intersectionality. When we talk about intersectionality, we are talking about the vulnerabilities those intersect with each other. For example, low income communities may face both economic and social vulnerability, limiting their capacity to adapt the physical risks. So, these vulnerabilities are intersecting each other. That low income communities may be facing economic vulnerability also and social vulnerability also. So, addressing these interconnected challenges actually require integrated strategies that consider all the dimensions of the vulnerability. So, now we have to deal the vulnerabilities with integrated strategies, so it can counter different types of vulnerabilities with similar types of strategies and plans. So, lastly, in order to effectively design adaptation strategies and policies that may attempt to mitigate the risk associated with the changing climate and eventually foster resilience in both the human and the environmental system, it becomes very much imperative that the vulnerability be understood and addressed. Without understanding the vulnerability, we cannot address it. Thank you.